You're not seriously thinking of going, are you?
Why not?
My cousin is a Jehovah, and he basically cut himself off from the family. It's what they make you do, you know.
I had no idea.
Typical cult.
If you've watched any recent cult documentaries, and they're kind of hard to avoid these days, you may have noticed a bold new strategy. Cult leaders admitting to followers that they are perceived by the outside world as a cult.
Hello, and welcome. I'm Nancy Salzman. I'm the president of Nexium Corporation and Executive Success Programs. If you get involved in a group, what's the word that people usually use to invalidate the group? Cult, right?
But like, my friend is like getting out and just, yeah. How's that possible? How is it possible that this scary cult leader, different person, can provide you with real good spiritual information?
Typical cult.
It's a bold strategy, Cotton. Let's see if it pays off for them.
Cults in the internet age have a problem. Well, they have a lot of problems. They're cults, but in the age of easily accessible information, cult members are inevitably going to encounter criticisms of their group or criticisms of similar groups that get them thinking. So, how do modern high-control groups address criticisms of their groups to their members? As a case study, a phrase which here means the only thing I ever talk about on this channel, let's look at Jehovah's Witnesses. Over the years covering the group after leaving, I've noticed they have a very clever way of deflating criticism.
Some may say unity of belief, you're brainwashed. Well, we do agree that our thinking has been washed clean from the complicated doctrines that have evolved since Jesus walked the earth.
But what does the voice of strangers say on this subject? Don't trust the faithful slave. He will mislead you.
We might call this tactic deflation. Jehovah's Witness leadership routinely bring up genuine criticisms of the group, but then don't really refute them.
So God is love, but he's going to kill billions. How's that work?
Well, it'll make sense later. But for now, let's just focus on what I was talking about earlier.
Yet, when I was a member, the effect of leadership bringing up these criticisms at all deflated them in my head. I would think, they're bringing up this objection, there must be no merit to them.
Have you ever heard the expression trial by media?
Why would my leaders even bring this up if there was anything to be worried about? After all, they're not even my leaders. My real leaders, Jesus, these guys are just the intermediaries. Today, we're going to be looking at a lot of examples of this. To start, let's look at how Watchtower deflates their primary source of bad press, their handling of child sexual abuse. They have a few ways of dealing with this.
Think about the apostate-driven lies and dishonesties that Jehovah's organization is permissive toward pedophiles. I mean, that is ridiculous, isn't it? Hebrews 13:9 labels false messages as strange teachings. Yes, they are the teachings of strangers. Some examples of their strange teachings are that the faithful slave protects pedophiles.
Putting aside the fact that Watchtower, for some reason, always picks the creepiest governing body member to deliver these addresses, this is another exercise in deflation. Stephen Lett is using a logical fallacy called a straw man argument, arguing against a hyperbolic, inaccurate version of the opposition rather than engaging with the actual argument. Nobody thinks that Jehovah's Witnesses are permissive towards pedophiles. The issue is the group's insufficient internal policies, which prioritize the group's image over common decency and, like, the law.
Inquiry underway in Sydney, Australia has uncovered disturbing information about child abuse within the Jehovah's Witnesses. Church representatives revealed that more than 1,000 members have been identified as child sexual abusers since 1950. The Commission learned that of those hundreds of cases, none was reported to police. An elder testified that its church practiced not to report sexual abuse, but rather to adopt a scriptural response to allegations.
In the hearing, various elders and even governing body member Jeffrey Jackson took the stand and found their deflation tactics falling apart when confronted with someone who wasn't under their influence.
Mr. Jackson, you've put it that they have a choice to leave or not to leave. For someone who wants to leave, perhaps because they've suffered abuse by someone in the organisation and don't feel that it's been treated properly or adequately, it's a very difficult choice, isn't it, because they must choose.
I agree with that.
And it can be a very cruel choice for them, not so.
I agree. It's a difficult choice.
And it can be personally devastating because they can lose their whole social network and their families.
That can be the case, yes.
Currently, a grand jury investigation is taking place in Watchtower's home state of Pennsylvania, which has already unearthed numerous alleged abusers who were reported to the group's elders, but not the authorities. Being a high-control group who demonizes the outside world, they literally believe the entire world is lying in the power of Satan, Watchtower's manual for congregation elders, called Shepherd the Flock of God, mandates that the elders not call the police upon receiving allegations of child sexual abuse. They are first to call the branch, the headquarters of Jehovah's Witnesses, where Watchtower's legal department will decide whether the authorities need to be involved. Watchtower has a non-defense of this, though, which brings us back to the next method of deflation, the big, silly misunderstanding.
Some secular authorities have drawn wrong conclusions about the involvement of the Congregation of Jehovah's Witnesses when an individual commits a serious wrong that violates both civil law and scriptural law. Part of the misunderstanding involves our use of the term judicial committee. Now, some erroneously conclude that the congregation is trying to take over the work of the police or the judicial courts, and that's simply not the case, as explained in the May 2019 Watchtower.
So this is almost gibberish to anyone outside the group, but it's not designed to appeal to anyone outside the group. This is spin for members. Here, governing body helper Gary Bro, that's his real name, crafts this simultaneously incredibly vague and incredibly specific scenario where journalists are somehow made vaguely aware of the general concept of judicial committees within Jehovah's Witnesses, and also vaguely aware of crimes like CSA within Jehovah's Witnesses, but then the journalist never researches either of these things and publish false reports based on assumptions. The entire talk that ensues is an exercise in the red herring fallacy, bringing up a completely unrelated point to distract from defending one's position.
So let's briefly review the history of handling judicial matters amongst God's people. I'd like to do so under this theme: older men and superior authorities standing in their proper place.
This is word salad, a Bible-y non sequitur that does nothing to address whether the practices of judicial committees are ethical, how they can traumatize abuse victims, or are arguably a form of abuse in and of themselves. But the fact that Gary Bro brings up this criticism at all deflates it in the minds of members. Now, if members hear criticisms in the media or from their friends or on the internet of judicial committees, they can think back to this talk and think, they probably read one of those fake news reports based on vague innuendos and misunderstandings. Here's governing body member David Splain using the same silly misunderstanding method.
Some people believe everything they read in the newspaper or see on TV. Do you? Should you? Consider this. Now, you're working from door to door, and you meet a householder who says, "You Jehovah's Witnesses are terrible people. You let your children die. You don't accept medical treatment." Well, you ask the householder, "Do you know any of Jehovah's Witnesses personally?" No. Then where did you get the idea that we let our children die and don't accept medical treatment? The householder says, "I have it on good authority. I read it in the newspaper." Well, if it's in the newspaper, it must be true, right? Now, if they just take the time to check the facts, they'd see that they're being lied to, but they don't check the facts.
Of course, conveniently, David Splain is not going to say what the facts are. He's just going to insist that anyone publishing anything negative about the group is not checking the facts, that there can always be some convoluted scenario to suppress the real, actual truth that's happening. And of course, the real, actual truth that's happening would validate that Jehovah's Witnesses are the one true religion.
Of course, to avoid a lawsuit for slander or libel, these media reports are very carefully worded. Remember, we talked about media reports and how these are very often carefully worded to avoid a lawsuit. So suppose a report indicates that someone has been charged with a crime or that he's being investigated. All right, you have two words, charged and investigated. it doesn't mean he's guilty.
But of course, Blaine doesn't want to say what the facts are because he doesn't actually want Jehovah's Witnesses to be able to fact-check him. Deflation as a tactic extends beyond quashing scandals, however. It can also be used to paper over theological logic gaps. Here's governing body member Sam Hurd bringing up a pretty significant theological objection, and then just not dealing with it.
A 5-year-old little girl asked, "Mommy, why does Jehovah let babies die from lack of food?"
Okay, this isn't super important, but what is going on with Sam Hurd saying mommy?
"Mommy, why does Jehovah let babies die?" "Mommy, when I get out, call me Sammy."
I guess it's only twice, but that's still more times than I would prefer.
"Mommy, mommy, 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 mommy." See, the little girl just heard that on the television set. Babies are dying for lack of food. Mommy says, "Honey," puts her arm around the little girl, "it has to do with the issue of sovereignty that was raised a long time ago."
He will go on to reference the, again, vague theological reason why God allows suffering generally, according to Watchtower. But he doesn't address the underlying issue. If God is all-powerful and all-loving, he should be able to prevent human suffering now while retaining free will. If he can't, he's not all-powerful. And if he can, but just allows for human suffering to continue to prove a point, that means he's not all-loving. The group likes to do this with one of the Bible's most debunked stories, Noah's Ark.
I began to feed my mind with different philosophies, different ideas, even studied different religions. And, you know, I told myself that I was doing that academically, but it started to influence the way that I thought and felt about things. Eventually, the elders reached out to me. I was very combative with those brothers. I even made the accusation that Noah's Ark was a fairy tale, that was part of mythology. Eventually, skillful use of the scriptures and just reasoning with me, the elders got me to realize that I had been carried off, or that I had been taken captive by human philosophy, by the deceptions and this empty reasoning of men.
Now, none of this provide a good reason to trust in a literalistic reading of an account, which clearly contradicts basic logic and centuries of science. But videos like this do signal to members quite clearly that skepticism towards the Noah's Ark story is a slippery slope to being pulled into Satan's world. All of these are ways the governing body of Jehovah's Witnesses and cult leaders like them consolidate control and spin the narrative. While I've been showing videos, since this is a video that you're watching, this sort of rhetoric appears all the time in Watchtower's printed literature, which predates the group's video propaganda by well over a century. A Reddit user named Turtles Inc. pointed out a really good example of this in Jehovah's Witnesses' current publication they use to convert prospective members called Enjoy Life Forever. He points out that in Lesson 54 of this book, the role of the faithful indiscreet slave, which is what witnesses call the governing body for Bible-y reasons, it's a long story. There's a question and answer section that says, some people say, if you listen to the governing body, you're just following men. What proves to you that Jesus is leading the governing body? And that doesn't answer the question.
Don't trust the faithful slave. He will mislead you.
The book raises a valid objection, but then doesn't provide an answer. What the paragraph implies is you're not following the governing body, you're following Jesus, and the group reiterates this constantly.
The governing body could be likened to the voice of Jesus, the head of the congregation. So when we willingly submit to the faithful slave, we're ultimately submitting to Jesus' authority and direction. At
this year's annual meeting, governing body member Jeffrey Winder said that the governing body can make mistakes and doesn't have to apologize, almost.
The governing body is neither inspired nor infallible, and so it can err in doctrinal matters or in organizational direction. Well, knowing this, then, we are not embarrassed about adjustments that are made, nor is an apology needed for not getting it exactly right previously.
By the way, I love how he almost says we don't apologize and then corrects himself to there's no need to apologize.
Nor is an apology needed.
Good save, Jeffrey. The second option wasn't equally crazy at all. But this is obviously a contradiction because if you're listening to the voice of Jesus, well, does Jesus make mistakes? Does Jesus want them to be making mistakes?
The governing body could be likened to the voice of Jesus.
The governing body is neither inspired nor infallible, and so it can err in doctrinal matters.
But maybe the perfect example of this is one I already showed but haven't talked about in depth. Because foreshadowing, not because I'm writing the script last minute and making it up as I go along.
Some may say unity of belief, you're brainwashed. Well, we do agree that our thinking has been washed clean.
This is how Watchtower suppresses doubts and critical thinking among Jehovah's Witnesses. Brainwashing, that's just scrubbing your brain clean with a scripture chamois. Unquestioning loyalty, that's unique to our group, and cool, actually. But of course, Jehovah's Witnesses' unity is not unique. It's a staple of every cult. If you're a Jehovah's Witness watching this, you might be thinking, but I don't follow man. I've read Enjoy Life Forever, Lesson 54. Everything I believe is based on the Bible. But what happens if you disagree with Watchtower's interpretation of the Bible? What if you came to the conclusion that the writers of the Bible maybe obviously had no idea that blood transfusions would ever be invented, that eating blood and digesting it is completely different than receiving a transfusion to stop you from bleeding to death? Well, that's just too bad, because you are not allowed to read the Bible and come to conclusions that make sense to you. If those conclusions disagree with the governing body's conclusions, you are supposed to suppress it. What, you think that sounds like brainwashing? Don't worry about it, we're just cleaning your brain folds so they're free of critical thinking dust bunnies. Cult leaders know they're cult leaders. They may think they're right, they may be drinking their own Flavorade, but they do know that the outside world sees them as cult leaders. So the only thing they can do is deflate every criticism they receive. Look at the JW.org Frequently Asked Questions article on blood transfusions, or don't if you don't want to be super mad like me right now. They bring up the very real criticism that Jehovah's Witnesses, including children and pregnant women, regularly die because of refusing blood transfusions. Needlessly die for reasons that could be easily solved with the blood transfusion. But they don't address it. This is totally unfounded. It's not like there's some magic professional person who dedicates years of their lives to understand what medical treatments are necessary to save people's lives. But my favorite part of this article is myth. Avoiding blood transfusions is very costly. Fact. Medical treatments that avoid blood transfusions are cost effective. Yeah, that was the concern. Yeah, avoiding a transfusion may cost you your life, but if you do live, your insurance payments will be perfectly affordable. Sure, people may call us a cult, but they just don't get it. Sure, people may call us brainwashed, but they're just jealous of how clean our skull meat is. Sure, we're constantly being accused of covering up child abuse, but all the victims are lying, and the courts are corrupt, and the judges and the jurors, those are also corrupt.
Court cases are often handled by a jury. Now, who are on the jury? Ordinary citizens with no legal training. But not only that, these ordinary citizens don't always have access to all the facts, because the judge and lawyers decide which facts will be shared with the jury. So it's unlikely that the whole truth will ever come out in court. Actually, neither side probably wants the whole truth to come out in court.
And the media is out to get us, and we already told you that we can make mistakes and don't need to apologize. And if you see us taking a bunch of out-of-court settlements from abuse survivors, that's not a weird thing for God's one true religion to do.
We may read that a person or an organization was sued and then settled out of court. Does settling out of court mean that they were guilty? Not necessarily.
If a governing body member goes to prison or something, well, you know who else was falsely imprisoned, right?
Or suppose that someone is convicted and put in jail. Or someone is found guilty by men, as Jesus was. It doesn't mean that he's guilty in the sight of God.
Thanks for watching, everybody. I'm currently thanking my latest patrons. Thank you for patroning me. Sound off on the right grammar in the comments. This tactic of deflecting criticisms has been on my mind for a while. I settled on the word deflate because I kind of think that's what it did in my brain. You know, I would be aware of the criticism. It would not necessarily go away, but it would deflate it, and just that doubt air would pump it back up again until the cult leaders deflated it. And I think that that's why cults have to regularly re-indoctrinate people, and they have to keep you in this hermetically sealed environment, because naturally certain criticisms are going to arise. A child was able to see this issue of suffering that Sam Hurd brings up, and the only way that you can really get to Sam Hurd's conclusion is by years and years of indoctrination and re-indoctrination and studying. So those complaints, at least in my brain, never really went away, but they did deflate and would kind of reinflate themselves every once in a while. I'm super sick when I'm recording this. I probably sound sick. And not just in the complimentary way. So sound off in the comments for other examples of this, and let me know if you would be interested in me diving into different groups in a similar manner.
Why does God, you didn't know him by Jehovah, why does God let little children starve to death? You've seen pictures on television and in the movies where a little baby is just hanging on to its mother's breast and there's not a drop of milk in that mommy's breast.